Podcast Alien Meditation, Episode 1. Welcome to the Alien Meditation Podcast, the program where we teach to connect with your stellar ancestors and empower your spirit with the Andean philosophy. I am Karen Prieto, shamanic facilitator, instructor, and founder of the international school Alien Meditation. Access alienmeditation.com to find content and courses that will help in your spiritual growth and your training in holistic therapies. I decided to create this podcast to humbly share the main spiritual experiences and approaches that I have had throughout my years of life. When I was a child, I don't have many memories of my childhood, but my mother tells me that when I was born premature, and I was running the risk of death. The doctor placed me in the incubator, and he did everything possible for me to live. But what seems curious to me was the observation that the doctor made to my mother, that even though they were doing everything in their power to save me, it was as if I was consciously forcing myself not to live. I find that comment curious coming from a doctor, because generally doctors are people with a very logical minds. But what I found interesting was his own observation or subjective diagnosis, what he made about the behavior of a newborn that was me. It should be noticed that this doctor must have already many experiences with the babies, and mine seemed particular to him, to the point of telling my mother that it seemed that I was straining to not live. By this, I mean that there are things that even though science wants to have full control, they cannot explain. In this case, that doctor performed all the procedures of the scientific methods to carry out my treatment. But in the end, he could not understand my behavior, and he came to the conclusion that perhaps there was something subjective that he could not explain, and that was not in the table of instructions of his scientific method. Perhaps the diagnosis for me was not wanting to live. That can be explained in many adult people with depression, but in a newborn child, it must be something quite out of the ordinary. After I grew up, I don't have many memories of my childhood, but something that I will always have in my memory is when I was 8 years old and I asked my sister what religion we were from. I remember very clearly when she told me that we are Catholic, and in my mind and in my heart I had a feeling of helplessness. And I thought to myself, again? That was unconsciously bad news for me, and at that moment I, an 8-year-old girl, said, "Catholic? Me again?" It is as if I had really disliked that news, and I respect the Catholic religion and religions in general very much. At no time I discriminate or speak ill of any specific religion, but I just want to share with you my reaction from when I was 8 years old. It was a reaction that is not normal for an 8-year-old girl. After that, I had dreams when I was a child that I was going into underground tunnels, and I also saw zoomorphic creatures that were aware of themselves and could speak but they were zoomorphic. They were like humans with rabbit faces and with different faces and forms of animals, and that I found them whenever I entered those tunnels under the earth. Now it's clear to me that those lucid dreams with these beings and these tunnels were shamanic dimensions of power where I was frequently instructed unconsciously. Then I grew up and lost my sensitivity until one day when I was in college, about to graduate at the age of 17, I had a colleague in the classroom, and one day she invited me to her house. But she warned me that there was a shadow in her room. I did not believe in anything supernatural at that time. When a person is religious but has not experienced any supernatural thing, that person say that she believes in spirit, believes in angels, believes in God, believes in that spiritual part. But in reality, that person knows nothing because the person has never experienced. So, despite the fact that I follow the Catholic religion, and I said that I believed in that world that the Bible speaks of, actually, I was totally unbelieving. I did not believe at all in that subtle world because I had never experienced it. For me, it was like a joke. So when my college asked me to be careful because in her room there was a shadow, I started to laugh. The whole time I was at her house, from time to time, I laughed about the shadow. And I didn't have any concern because to me that was a fanciful thing. But that same day at night, I had a very unpleasant surprise. When I was in the phase between asleep and awake, in that phase where the person is almost asleep, I felt that I was unfolding. I felt that a subtle part of my body was unfolding from my physical body, and at that precise moment, a shadow was taking advantage to bother me. And from that night on, every night it was recurrent that this being annoyed me, trying to suffocate me, slapping me, taking the air out of my stomach, shaking my body, and all series of things that caused me a lot of terror and a lot of displeasure. I once heard from my mother that the house where we lived in a small town in Colombia was a very old house, and that before my mother's family lived there, another family lived where a child died of poisoning. From the moment I began to receive attacks, I became more sensitive to the energy world. For me, it was like a humiliation of my ego, that sudden jolt of that shadow being that he gave me, so that I was aware of that energetic world. From that action that shadowy being decided to give me, I was aware of the spiritual world. So here comes a reflection. Until what point that gloomy being was actually not that gloomy? Because it opened my eyes, it woke me up spiritually, and it made me see a new reality. It made me aware of the other side. Actually, that being was not so bad. Then, another day, I decided to take a nap in the afternoon, and I lay down on my bed And when I was in that state, between asleep and awake, I heard the voice of a child, a screaming child. That child was screaming because clearly there was an adult who was bothering him. That adult perceived that I heard him. Then he threw me something at my head. When he threw me that something on my head, I woke up. And I woke up with the impression of the blow that being gave me. From that moment, I understood that the astral world works similar to the physical world, where there are good people and bad people, and where the law of survival is also present. Another day, when I was sleeping, suddenly I felt myself unfolding, but I was unfolding more than usual, until I felt like I really detached myself from my physical body. When I detached myself from my body, I was sliding with a force that I could not control. That force was creeping me up and was pushing me to my left side. Near my left side was a wall that divided my room from my parents' room. As I was sliding, I felt closer and closer to the wall, and I was feeling the cold of the concrete of the wall. And a feeling of terror and panic came over me as I imagined what could happen to me when I passed through that wall. Then, when I screamed with all my force in the astral plane, my subtle body returned to my physical body. Then I woke up with my fast beating heart. These were my experiences of how I was aware of that supernatural world that is a parallel reality to the reality of the third dimension and that works with similar laws. From there, I began to understand that this being that bothered me at first, he actually wanted to teach me a life lesson. I humbly asked his forgiveness for making fun of him. Since the night I asked for my forgiveness, he has never bothered me again. Throughout my life, I have had several astral experiences, but this was the first of them. I want to humbly share it with all of you, to show you how a person who was completely unbeliever and unaware of that other reality became a being completely respectful to that reality. With this, I'm not wanting to convince anyone that you have to believe in spirits, in astral travel, or in beings from another dimensions. Those are just my personal experiences that I wanted to share. Because everyone can and should have their own experiences. But the moral of this story, and what I would like to highlight, is that we can live and have spiritual practices where we do not rely only on the words of a book or in the teachings of a leader, but we also try to practice and experience for ourselves. No one is truly going to discover the taste of a food if they don't taste it. It's not use just hearing from another person or read from a book that that food tastes this or that. We can get an idea of the taste of that food from the comments that a person made or from what we saw in a book. But we will not truly know that food unless we eat it. It seems ridiculous to compare spiritual practices with the example of the food, but by this I mean that it doesn't matter how many hours you listen to a religious leader or read a book. If there is no concomitant practice, my invitation is that you try to discover for yourself that spiritual and energetic world. You don't need to do difficult or supernatural things like being a medium or doing astral travel, but simple things like practicing a daily breath to be aware of your own emotions and thus be able to open the door of your intuition. Perform meditative practices to be more sensitive to the spiritual world and be able to have that openness to be in communion with your sixth sense and begin to experience the spiritual experiences from your own perception. And with this, I close this episode. Thank you very much for your time and attention. If you liked this episode, please like, share it, and subscribe so that this content reaches more people that can benefit from it. See you in the next episode. Bye.